Read me a story, tell me a tale of fairies that sparkle and galleons that sail, princes and dragons, castles set high, tall magic beanstalks and witches that fly. Read me a story, an old one or new. Read me a story from you.
Hello, and welcome to Tell Me a Story. My name's Charlie, and today's story is The Elves and the Shoemaker. Once upon a time, many years ago, there lived a shoemaker and his wife. They were honest, hard-working, but very poor. Winter had set in and the shoemaker had only enough leather to make one pair of shoes. He cut the leather out ready to sew it together in the morning and went off to bed. In the morning, he went into the workshop and there, on the bench, to his amazement, was a pair of finished shoes. They were perfect, not a stitch out of place. He called his wife and they both stared in wonder at the beautiful workmanship. Well, later that day, a rich gentleman came into the shop and bought the shoes. He was so impressed with the quality, he paid double what the shoemaker was asking for them. The shoemaker and his wife were so happy, he could now afford to pay for enough leather to make 2 pairs of shoes. That night, he cut out the leather for 2 pairs of shoes and left it on the bench for the morning. The shoemaker and his wife went off to bed. In the morning, the shoemaker went into his workshop to start work, and there on the bench were 2 pairs of shoes, crafted to the same high standard as before. Later that day, 2 customers came to the shop and bought the shoes for a very good price. In fact, it meant the shoemaker had enough money to buy enough leather for 4 pairs of shoes. As usual, he cut out the leather and left it on his bench ready for the morning and went off to bed. In the morning, just as before, he found the shoes, 4 pairs this time, and all of them perfectly made. He sold all 4 pairs that day and they fetched a very, very good price. This went on for a number of weeks, and gradually the shoemaker and his wife became quite wealthy. No longer did they have to go hungry or sit and shiver without a fire to heat them. One day, just before Christmas, the shoemaker decided to stay up and watch quietly to see who was making these wonderful shoes. His wife decided to stay up with him. So they hid themselves behind the curtains in the workshop and waited. Sure enough, just after the stroke of midnight, 2 tiny elves dressed in raggedy clothes squeezed in through a gap in the door. They jumped and danced all the way to the workbench where the leather was laid out, and they set to work. The elves worked so fast that their hands were a blur. The shoemaker and his wife were mesmerized. They tapped and stitched and tapped, and in no time at all the shoes were done. There stood a row of fine shoes, perfectly sewn with not a stitch out of place. The elves then danced and jumped all the way to the door and disappeared into the cold night. The shoemaker couldn't believe what he'd just seen. Had he been dreaming? His wife, who also saw the elves, was so concerned for them with their raggedy clothes that she decided that she would make them new clothes. A shirt, trousers, and a jacket to keep them warm. Something special to repay them for the good service they'd done. The shoemaker suggested that he make them a pair of new boots each to thank them. That evening, the shoemaker and his wife set to work to make the clothes and the boots. When they were finished, instead of leaving the leather out on the bench, they laid out the clothes and boots for the tiny elves and waited behind the curtains again to see what would happen. Just after the stroke of midnight, the 2 tiny elves squeezed through the gap in the door and jumped and danced all the way to the workbench. But when they got there, they didn't find any leather to make shoes. They found beautiful handmade clothes and handmade boots for them to wear. Without a moment's hesitation, the elves tried on their new clothes. They fitted perfectly, as did the boots. They were so happy and they hopped and danced all around the workbench, and then, quick as a flash, they jumped and danced to the door and disappeared. That was the last time the tiny elves visited the workshop, but it didn't matter, because the shoemaker was very well known by then and always had plenty of customers wanting his fine shoes. The end. That was the story of the Elves and the Shoemaker. Thanks for listening. Bye-bye.
Read me a story, an old one or new. Read me a story. A story from you.
Yay!
Did you enjoy that? Well, if you did, click the subscribe button and then you'll never miss anything from Cheeky Chimps TV again.